This lecture is from chapter 15, and it is specifically on mood disorders. A quote I really like is, "The experience I've had is that once you start talking about experiencing a mental health struggle, you realize that you're actually part of quite a big club." I think more of us have mood disorders and struggle with that than we realize, so it's something that should definitely be talked about and not have such a stigma. So first, let's define what a mood disorder is. It is characterized by severe disturbances in mood and emotions, most often depression, but also mania and elation. Of course, all of us experience fluctuations in our moods and emotional states. However, people with mood disorders also experience mood fluctuations, but their fluctuations are extreme, distort their outlook on life, and impair their ability to function. There are two main categories of mood disorders. The first is depression, or depressive disorders, which consists of a broad spectrum of symptoms that range in severity. Of course, depressed people feel sad, they feel discouraged and hopeless. They often lose interest in activities that they once enjoyed. They often experience a decrease in drive, such as hunger and sex, and they frequently doubt their personal worth. The second category of mood disorders is bipolar and related disorders. In the past, this was called manic depression, same thing as bipolar. This is a group of disorders in which mania is the defining feature. And to define mania, it is a state of extreme elation and agitation. When people experience mania, they may become extremely talkative, behave recklessly, or attempt to take on many tasks simultaneously. So let's look further at the first type of disorder, which is major depressive disorder. So in order to be diagnosed with depression, let's look here at the symptoms that must be present. And at least one of these symptoms has to be reported or observed over a 2-week period. Either depressed mood or anhedonia, which means a loss of interest in activities you used to enjoy. So you have to have at least one of those two, and then at least 4 of the following over the same 2 weeks. Perhaps a significant weight loss when not trying to lose weight, insomnia, sleeping too little or sleeping too much nearly every day, psychomotor agitation or retardation, your movements are slowing down or you appear agitated, fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day, a feeling of worthlessness or inappropriate guilt, diminished ability to think, you have trouble thinking, concentrating, making decisions, and recurrent thoughts of death, suicidal ideation, or a plan to attempt suicide. So that's what it requires to get an official diagnosis of major depressive disorder. There are subtypes of depression. Seasonal depression, or perhaps the winter blues you might have heard of, applies to situations in which a person experiences the symptoms of major depressive disorder only during a particular time of year. Most likely it's going to be fall or winter as time changes and things get colder and obviously it's darker. A lot of people go through that seasonal depression. Another type is postpartum depression, which applies to women who experience major depression during pregnancy or in the 4 weeks following the birth of their child. These women often feel very anxious and may even have panic attacks. They may feel guilty, agitated, and be weepy, and they may not want to hold or care for their newborn. Persistent depressive disorder. These people experience depressed moods most of the day, nearly every day, for at least 2 years, as well as at least 2 of the other symptoms of major depressive disorder. So if you remember, you can go back and look at the other symptoms. They have to experience at least 2 of those. People with persistent depressive disorder are chronically sad and melancholy, but do not meet all the criteria for major depression. Again, remember that to receive a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, at least 4 of those listed symptoms, if you look back, have to be there. But with persistent depressive disorder, only 2, and it has to be persistently sad over around 2 years. So let's move on from major depressive disorder to bipolar disorder. A person with bipolar disorder, as I said earlier, used to be called manic depression, often experiences mood states that vacillate between depression and mania. That is, the person's mood is said to alternate from one emotional extreme to the other. So, just as we looked at the criteria for depression, let's look at the criteria for bipolar disorder. For a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, it is necessary to meet the following criteria for a manic episode, which may have been preceded by and may be followed by hypomanic or major depressive episodes. And if you look to the left, hypomania is simply a milder form of mania, is all that is. So, to be diagnosed with a manic episode, a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood, and abnormally and persistently increased goal-directed activity or energy lasting at least 1 week and present most of the day, nearly every day. And during the period of mood disturbance and increased energy, 3 or more of the following symptoms must be present in order to receive the official diagnosis. There must be an inflated self-esteem and feeling of grandiosity, a decreased need for sleep, more talkative than usual or pressure to keep talking, flight of ideas or experience thoughts racing, very easily distracted, an increase in goal-directed activity, and excessive involvement in activities that have high potential for painful consequences or dangerous activities. So you can see there's a difference between major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder contains that mania or manic episodes. So what causes mood disorders? There's a biological basis. Mood disorders have been shown to have a strong genetic and biological basis. People with mood disorders often have imbalances in certain neurotransmitters, particularly norepinephrine and serotonin. These neurotransmitters are important regulators of the bodily functions that are disrupted in mood disorders, including appetite, sex drive, sleep, arousal, and mood. Medications that are used to treat major depressive disorder typically boost serotonin and norepinephrine activity. So biologically, there's a genetic, huge biological basis for mood disorders. There's also something called the diathesis stress model. And you can see on the right the interaction of diathesis and stress and depression. Diathesis is simply just what we talked about, the genetic traits that predispose the individual to a mood disorder. And then once that's combined with life stresses, for example, childhood sexual abuse, family conflict, emotional abuse, anything like that, the diathesis stress model says when a person has a genetic tendency to be depressed and then their life is full of these stressful things, that can lead to depression. Cognitive theories, which is related to the diathesis stress model. Aaron Beck's theory, he theorized that depression-prone people possess depressive schemas or mental predispositions to think about most things in a negative way. Depressive schemas contain themes of loss, failure, rejection, worthlessness, and inadequacy, and may develop early in childhood in response to adverse experiences, then remain dormant until they are activated by stressful or negative life events. So you can see this also has a genetic component. In other words, they have a predisposition to think about things in a negative way. And then when that gets combined with adverse experiences, stressful, negative life events, that can lead to depression. There's also hopelessness theory. This postulates that a particular style of negative thinking leads to a sense of hopelessness, which then leads to depression. According to this theory, hopelessness is an expectation that unpleasant outcomes will occur or that desired outcomes will not occur, and that there is nothing one can do to prevent such outcomes. And again, you'll see sort of perhaps a genetic predisposition for negative thinking, and then that leads to a sense of hopelessness, which is a horrible feeling because you don't believe, as it says, desired outcomes will occur. and you believe there's nothing you can do to prevent that possibility. Also, rumination focuses on how people's thoughts about their distressed moods, depressed symptoms in particular, can increase the risk and duration of depression. The repetitive and passive focus on the fact that one is depressed and dwelling on depressed symptoms rather than distracting oneself from the symptoms or attempting to address them in an active problem-solving manner. So rumination is essentially, as it says, repetitive focus on the fact that you're depressed and dwelling on that and not realizing or attempting to do things that might make it better. So those are just some theories of what can cause a major depressive disorder. That's just a real basic view of major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. As always, if you have questions, please let me know.